So anyway, if you have any questions that aren't too hard, I'm happy to try to answer them. About this book or any other book or Oprah, or even about Sandra Bullock. Yeah.
You lived in Rockville Center, is that right?
I lived in Franklin Square, which was very close.
I just wondered, is the water there something that produces wonderful writers? Because Alice McDermott is also...
Alice McDermott and I, we met, and it turned out we went to the same Knights of Columbus dances.
You didn't know each other?
We didn't know each other because she went to the Catholic school and she sat on the good girl side. And I was a gate crasher and didn't. But it was really funny because her book that night takes place in the same town that I grew up in. It's a very different view. And I wrote about that town in my first book called Property of, which actually Ferris just re-released after 32 years in their classics division. And I just wrote an introduction to it. So it's very interesting that we grew up in the same town. She's a lovely person and a wonderful writer. Yeah, and it was also kind of Valley Stream, where a lot of writers have come from also. That area. And then we all escaped really quickly. Well, my feeling about writing, I think what really influenced me is the way I started out, which was I was a graduate student. I had a fabulous professor, my mentor, Albert Gerard, and I wrote a story, and he sent it to a friend of his at City College who published it in a little magazine. And I got a letter from a great editor named Ted Solitaire saying and I was in school, I was in graduate school, and I had 2 jobs, and he sent me a letter saying, "Do you have a novel?" And I sent back a letter saying, "Yes, I do," and I started writing it that afternoon. And I wrote fast, and in 6 months I had a novel, because I felt like, who's going to ever ask me if I have a novel? No one's going to ever ask me this question again. And so I think that was the beginning of kind of the fast writing that I was able to do, because I just felt like it's now or never. I do a lot of revision, and I think that, for me, I always feel that, I'm not going to live long enough to tell all the stories that I have to tell. So that's part of kind of the driving force, like I have to get them out because I just don't have time to tell them all. Yeah. Yeah.
My wife told me the book takes place in Paris, and we both love Paris. Can you tell me about Paris? Is that one of your favorite places?
Well, it's funny because when I was in graduate school, my professor, Albert Gerard, he had this student who he really loved who ran the Brown Creative Writing Program, named a novelist named John Hawkes. And he always talked to us about the book that John Hawkes had written called The Lime Twig, which took place in London, and that John Hawkes had never been to London. And that you didn't have to have experienced something to know it or to feel. You just had to be able to feel it. So I wrote a book called Illumination Night, which took place on Martha's Vineyard, and I had never been to Martha's Vineyard. And then I decided, well, I probably should go and just make sure I have the street names right. And I went, and it was exactly the way I imagined it. So sometimes I feel like what you imagine is truer to the real place than the real place. As for Paris, I went when I was a kid, and I went back because my nephew moved there and fell in love with a French girl, and I went to visit him and kind of experienced it through this couple in love, and it was just a beautiful place to be. I'm going back next week. I don't know, when I got there I thought, why haven't I been here every year? It was that kind of sense. So I think hopefully I make Paris feel alive. I think I do. I hope I do. And I have to say, the last scene takes place at my favorite place in Paris. And my son just went there, and he's going back again. And I said, you have to go to this one place. And he did. And he said, you're right. It is the best place in Paris. So when you get to the last part of the book, you'll know what I'm talking about. You should go there. I read a lot of fairy tales. And fairy tales are kind of threaded through the Story Sisters. Every chapter begins with a fairy tale. And I always felt as a child reader that a lot of the literature that I was given was kind of talking down to me, and that fairy tales really told the truth. They told the bare, bloody truth about psychological life. And I feel like in my book, if you read all of the fairy tales in order, you would find kind of like a psychological map of the Story Sisters and what the inside of these girls are really like. So I was really influenced by what I read, which was fairy tales. I read a lot of science fiction and fantasy. I was a huge Ray Bradbury fan. I love Shirley Jackson and still do. I think she really was the precursor for Stephen King and all the writers that followed her. So that's what I read. That's what influenced me. And I really think the tradition of literature is magic. Whether it's myth or fairy tale, I always feel like reality is the new kid on the block, not as interesting to me. But thank you. Yeah.
I haven't read the Story Sisters yet, I just bought it. But It sounds like there's a lot of made-up language, and I wondered if, is there? I mean,
Yeah, there's a made-up language.
and so how did you come upon that? How did you keep it consistent through the book?
Well, for me, luckily, I didn't have to do what Tolkien did, which was kind of create a whole grammar and a whole vocabulary, because I was doing a language that was begun by teenage girls. So I felt like they wouldn't pay that much attention to grammar, and neither did I. So it's kind of a mix of what is influential in their lives, Russian and French and Latin and English and slang. But I was thinking a lot about the sisters, the literary sisters who created imaginary worlds, the Alcotts and the Brontes, and it was really funny that the New York Times, when they reviewed this book, called it Little Women on Mushrooms, which was interesting because there are a lot of references to Little Women actually throughout the book, so I was glad that they got that part right.